Welcome to Trends with Benefits, a podcast by Van Eck with a forward-looking perspective. We explore new ways of thinking about the markets, investing, work, and life. Here's your host, Ed Lopez.
Today I'm speaking with Janet Alvarez. She's a TV and online contributor to CNBC and Telemundo, executive editor of Wisebread, and is currently a visiting Nieman Fellow at Harvard, where she is one of 10 journalists selected to lead projects focusing on COVID and its impact on diverse communities. We'll chat about financial literacy, the impact of COVID on people of color. Perhaps we'll have some time to talk about the state of journalism and even our home state of Texas. Janet, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure being with you, Ed.
So, one thing that I think people still find fascinating when it comes to financial literacy, and actually as I was just kind of reviewing some various studies and reports on some of this, is that we can even say here in the U.S. that financial illiteracy is a problem, that there is still a low and declining rate of financial literacy in the U.S. Is that surprising to you as well?
No, it's really not at all. Even amongst white-collar professionals' degree of financial literacy is pretty astounding. And it's something that's a chronic problem. It's in many ways kind of almost intractable. A lot of us who work in the financial sphere or in financial education are left scratching our heads wondering, how do we reach more people? How do we encourage more people to become interested in learning manage finances? And the answer is that it really comes down to accessing people's pain points, where and when they need to think about money. Are they saving up for a wedding, or are they planning on retiring in the next 10 years and need to chart a course to get there? Or are they considering investing in a graduate school education? Whenever people encounter big questions pertaining to money, we find that an interest in financial literacy increases. But aside from that, it continues to be a challenge to encourage people to develop sort of the basic financial literacy we hope everyone would have to make the best possible choices.
A lot of your work focuses on financial literacy and democratizing investing and helping people really kind of bridge that gap between Main Street and Wall Street. How did this become an important topic for you to cover?
Encountering it myself in my personal life and in the personal lives of people I care about. When I graduated business school, it was at the peak of the Great Recession last decade. So jobs were scarce. I found myself with a ton of student loan debt. At the time, Obamacare hadn't yet been passed. So when I finished grad school, I got sick. I didn't have health insurance. So I ran up $10,000 or more of medical debt too. And I found myself in really dire financial straits. I thought, here I am. I'm a financial journalist by trade. I have an MBA and I'm unemployed. I have tons of medical debt, tons of student loan debt. What am I going to do? And the simple answer was, it wasn't learning more, but necessarily about investing or financial markets that was going to get me out of trouble. It was learning more about day-to-day financial management. And I think that's sort of the impasse that a lot of people come to, is they hear money management or they hear financial literacy and they think about stocks and investing, bond portfolio. And really, it's much more than that. It's about learning how to manage through the day-to-day issues that millions of Americans encounter. And I found myself in that position, and I found many of my loved ones and friends in that position. I thought, we have to escape from this cycle. How do we do it? And that's when I began learning a great deal more and taking an avid interest in educating not only myself, but also readers and millions of Americans to make that change in their lives too.
Do you think that the lack of exposure is a key element to financial illiteracy, or is it demographics, or is it just you almost have to wait until that event happens in your life that you're forced to deal with it?
I think so. I think, there's an old saying in life that basically that the axiom is that the things that you learn for yourself, you never forget. The things that are taught to you or that you learn in a classroom, you might not remember forever. So if you learn about mortgage rates and the home buying process by buying a home, you might remember that a lot more readily. Similarly, if you find yourself unemployed and having to budget or to manage through that process, you might remember those lessons and internalize them. And the key challenge, I think, is helping people acquire these key lessons before difficulty strikes or before they encounter a situation in which they're suddenly scrambling to get the information together to make good choices. One of the keys that I've learned in my career is speaking to people about money positively. So often in the financial realm, we are chastising people for giving them slaps across the wrist. Oh, invest more for retirement. Oh, you're spending outside of your budget, or you're not making wise financial choices. Really, the language we should be using is really positive language. Here's your chance to achieve your dreams. Here's how you get that wonderful vacation. Here's how you afford the home you want. Here's how you get to retire before you're 70. Here's how you get to achieve all of the things you really want to achieve. And it's in that transformation from chastising people to empowering them by using positive financial language and by encouraging them to build toward their dreams that you see people then go, okay, this is not just a lesson I need to learn in school. It's something that will actually make my life better. It's something that will actually enable me to reach goals that are near and dear to my heart.
So what have you noted about COVID's economic impact on people of color?
Well, a lot of us have seen it was disproportionately high. So Latinos and Black Americans suffered higher unemployment rates than other ethnic groups in our society. So that in itself has long running ramifications, right? Because we know that when you undergo a period of unemployment, you don't catch up as soon as you get a new job. So it's not as if your finances go back to where they were as soon as you're employed again. One, you might not find a job that paid as much as the one you had. Two, you might have incurred debt or spent your savings during that time. And then three, you're thrown off your financial trajectory. You can't invest as much. You can't save for retirement as much. And that can take years to rebuild. So for minority communities that were already behind in some senses, this was a continued stumbling block. And we see today still Hispanic and Black Americans continue to lag in unemployment and continue to lag in homeownership and continue to lag and other very essential financial indicators. It also exposed, I think, a lot of other forms of inequity in society. So the PPP loans, which first came out last year, were intended to help bridge some of that inequity and some of that divide. But PPP loans we found in the first round were going disproportionately to larger businesses, white-owned businesses. And so a lot of people of color were being left out because smaller lenders didn't have as much access to loans and to doling out the loans. The second round of PPP was much better. This current administration put a specific focus on targeting people of color, small businesses, community lenders, and historically Black and underserved communities to ensure that PPP loans went to the demographics that needed them most.
Do you find that there are certain communities that just don't feel like they have access to the banking community, and maybe that's one reason they're not really engaged in, call it financial literacy or planning for adverse events like COVID?
Yeah, and so I think there are a few categories of people, right, for whom that's the case. And so young people, people who work in informal employment or whose employment is not entirely W-2 based. There are many groups of people, many demographics who simply can't or don't want to access the traditional banking sector. In most cases, it's can't access the traditional banking sector. People with poor credit also just don't benefit from the traditional banking sector as well. And people who have uneven incomes that fluctuate on a regular basis. So if you're a freelancer, if you drive for Uber, if you're somebody who doesn't earn income regularly, well, then you have a harder time accessing financial products, everything from a mortgage to a credit card. And that creates further inequity, and that puts people even further behind.
You know, there's some people out there that say things like cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin is a way to kind of bridge that gap and help people reaching the unbanked, if you will. What do you think about that?
First, I'll say that I think financial innovation and financial technology in general are very good things. They're very empowering things. The most empowering innovations are coming from the fintech sector, and they are very democratic. They allow people to access investing and access information in ways they might not have been able to do so in the past. On the other hand, a lot of financial innovations carry more volatility and more risk. And that's what's difficult to communicate to users properly. The concept of financial risk, the concept of volatility is a pretty complex one. I mean, at its basic core, people understand the value of an asset can go up and can go down, but they don't understand in real terms just how quickly that can happen or what a magnified effect it can have on your overall wealth and your overall disposition toward money. And that's what's a challenge to communicate. And that's why I think we have a lot of work to do to educate consumers, especially novices or people who don't have a lot of experience with investing, about the inherent volatility of Bitcoin and a lot of new and emerging asset classes. How do you deal with that volatility? What does it mean for your overall portfolio? What does it mean for your overall financial picture? Can you handle that amount of volatility in your portfolio and in your financial life? People need to be able to answer those questions, and it's difficult to answer those questions if you don't have good guidance to do so. And I'm not sure that that's happening right now. Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're interesting investments or interesting financial tools, but I'm not sure that they are the ones equipped to communicate that concept of financial volatility to prospective owners of those tools. And it's up, I think, to financial educators, the financial system overall, to help educate and empower people in that regard.
That's one thing that's always kind of struck out to me when people talked about using Bitcoin as a way to empower these communities. It's like, I think it's so volatile. I didn't quite get that argument, but I admit that there's some real pros in the underlying technology. But so let's take it back to some of the basics. And now looking at a post-COVID kind of recovery standpoint, what are some of the key concepts that people need to keep in mind to set themselves up for perhaps to protect themselves from the next pandemic or other crisis?
Well, I think the first thing is to remember the lessons you learned during this crisis. There's an old rule of thumb that every time you get a raise, you should save half of it, right? So if you are earning $2 more per hour than you were last year, you can spend that extra $1 per hour, but the other dollar per hour, save it. And you can do that in your retirement account, or you can do that in your emergency savings account or your investing account. And that applies for everyone, right? So that applies for white collar professionals as much as it does for college kids or everyone in between. And it's a lesson that's very difficult to master and very difficult to learn. Spending creep is something that's very real. The more we earn, the more we want to spend. So I think it's a critical lesson that a lot of us were confronted with during the COVID economy, and something that I hope we will have mastered and will keep with us into the future. The second critical lesson is just about, again, the importance of an emergency fund. I don't think anyone really expected that they would be at home potentially for months, maybe even a year or more as a consequence of COVID. Nobody expected that. And while we're unlikely to encounter something like COVID again in the near future, in our own lives, we might encounter a disability, an illness, a new child that we have to take care of, and we can't necessarily go into the office for as much anymore, a parent that becomes ill and we have to care for. There are a number of circumstances that might in some ways mirror COVID that might recur in many of our lives. And so we have to be prepared for that. We have to take those critical learnings about emergency savings, being properly insured, having contingency plans in place. Third, it's a lesson about investing in general. Ironically, 2020 was a pretty good year for investors. And 2021 really hasn't been a bad one either. So it's a reminder that just because the economy is faring poorly doesn't mean your investments won't, right? And that there aren't asset categories that are going to outperform. And just a reminder that Main Street is in many ways detached from Wall Street, and the real economy and asset class performance aren't necessarily correlated. And so you shouldn't make decisions about one based on the other.
Yeah, the whole how the market's been performing, I'm afraid some people might get the wrong idea about investing and how easy it is. I think probably it's best to start saving and like, as you said, have a kind of emergency fund, build up enough savings, then start investing. I don't know. Do you have a certain approach to that, or do you write about different ways of even beginning investing?
Yeah. So there's a very simple heuristic tool. It's a ladder. And basically, you start where I was when I finished grad school. And if you have a ton of high interest debt, your first responsibility is to tackle that high interest debt. Tackling the high interest debt, however, doesn't necessarily mean paying it all off, right? Because the worst situation you could be in is to have absolutely $0 in savings. I would rather have $10 in debt and $10 in savings than use my $10 in savings to pay off the $10 in debt, because then I just have $0. Then if I get laid off, if I get sick, then I have nothing to fall back on. What you want to do is formulate a plan to handle your high interest debt. And that can mean calling your creditors, asking for lower interest rates. That means calling your student loan lenders and getting on an income-based repayment program that ties how much you pay to how much you earn. So if you're earning very little, you pay very little or nothing. That can mean trying to renegotiate debt. That can mean just coming up with a budget that enables you to repay that debt. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to pay off all the debt at once. And I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have, and that prevents them from ever building meaningful savings or a retirement plan, right, in your youth. Because when you're in your 20s and your early 30s, you're paying off student loans or you're handling other types of debt at any age. Your inclination might be to just pay off that debt before you save aggressively. And that's not necessarily right. Because if it's going to take you years to pay off that debt, as it can in many cases, you don't want to wait years to start building retirement savings or to save for an emergency fund. So I would say the first thing is handle your debt by making sure you have a plan for it. Second, start building an emergency fund of at least 6 months worth of basic living expenses. And basic living expenses, as we know, does not include Netflix or Thai food. It means basic living expenses, your rent, health insurance, utilities, transportation. Beyond that, ensure that you're contributing at least to your minimum match to your retirement account. So if your employer offers a 401k or 403b or something similar, and they offer a match, That's free money you're leaving on the table. Make sure you're contributing at least the minimum required to get that match. Beyond that, then you can start looking at more aggressive debt repayment. And beyond that, then you can start looking at investing. And that additional investing can come in the form of additional 401k, 403b, or IRA contributions, or an investing account, depending upon your tax situation. When you get to that point where you're thinking about investing, once you've got your debt in check, once you're paying more than the minimums on your debt, exceeded your minimum match contributions on your 401k, then you need to start thinking about, do I need a financial advisor, or do I need a robo-advisor, or do I need to consult with a financial professional of some sort who can help me make the best decisions based on my particular tax situation, based on my particular objectives and needs and goals. But working from that hierarchy, getting your debt in order first, then your emergency savings, then basic retirement savings, then really going after your debt, and beyond that, investing is the simple hierarchy that I think works for most people.
Did you ever think about becoming a financial advisor yourself? That was a pretty good explanation.
So I've worked in finance and CFP candidate and so forth. Being it's essentially what I do. I give financial advice in my articles and in my videos and in my suggestions. Working as a financial advisor, I don't know, maybe that's something that the future holds for me. I'm really enjoying being a financial journalist and reaching people this way right now.
How did you get into journalism?
So I actually I was an econ major in undergrad. I studied economics and organization behavior. I answered an ad one day on Craigslist looking for a co-host for a local AM talk radio show. It was not affiliated with the college, just a talk radio show in Chicago. So I, on a lark, just answered the ad and went in for an audition, and I got the gig. And I ended up putting a lot of elbow grease into it, a lot of effort. And at the time, we were interviewing local politicians and professors and economists, and we even interviewed Barack Obama when he was running for state senate. The show ended up being something of a local success, and it touched on a lot of econ topics. So when I graduated college, I'd already built up this nice little resume and ended up getting a job at Reuters in New York City. And I worked in print journalism for a while, went over to the TV and video side when online video was just beginning. So I was there to sort of see the digital transformation of journalism take off, and particularly in financial journalism. I think it was a very democratizing thing because suddenly you had financial information everywhere online, and people didn't have to subscribe to the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal to get financial information, which used to be basically the only way you could get financial news in the past. Now you had Investopedia being born and Wisebread, where I work, and a million other personal finance and investing sites suddenly being born, and people being able to democratically access all of this information about money management and investing. So I am dating myself and giving away my age a little bit, but I was there for that entire transformation. And I saw it take place, and I kind of evolved with it. I was covering credit default swaps and options during the financial crisis. So I was right in the heart of it when it happened. And I've kind of had that bird's eye view of the sort of evolution of financial news and the world of finance too over the past 20 years.
What would you say is one way financial advisors or those in the investment community like myself or that work at a fund company, what can we do to help people become more literate when it comes to financial concepts?
So again, I've worked in finance. I worked in options trading. I worked for big fund managers, and I have produced content for them. One of the mistakes we're making is not reaching people where they are in terms of their financial knowledge. A lot of people just really need to understand different asset classes. What is a bond? What are the essential characteristics of a bond? What's an ETF? What are the essential characteristics of an ETF? What is compound interest? What is the time value of money? These are topics and subjects that we take for granted in the investing space, and we assume that people are familiar with them, and people may have heard of them, and a lot of people might nod along, oh yeah, an ETF. Oh yeah, the time value of money. But they may, when they sit down and actually grapple with the concept, they may not really understand it fully. And even those of us who work in this space might find that we occasionally come across concepts that we really, when you sit down with it, you don't understand fully. So our first responsibility is to ensure people have access to that basic information without talking down to them, without assuming that you're doing anything wrong at all whatsoever if you don't know, the basics of the money dictionary. We have to reach people where they are because these basics are just not being addressed. They're not being addressed in high school. They're not really being addressed in college unless you're a finance or economics major. There's no place where people can come for that education. And so your investing professionals, the investing industry should be the place where you get that information, that basic education that otherwise we're expected to just pick up, I guess, by reading the Wall Street Journal or CNN Money or asking, your Uncle Bill who's good with money about stocks. There has to be a better organized way.
And I'm just kind of curious, being in journalism now, and you talked a little bit about the transition, the digital transformation of journalism. This is a very broad question, but how would you characterize the state of journalism today?
So, I mean, it's a dichotomy, and I think a lot of people have expressed it similarly, that journalism is at once stronger and weaker than it's ever been. I work in digital journalism, and I think the social media and digital revolution has been one of the most powerful tools, as many would agree, for the empowerment and literacy of billions and billions of people. At the same time, it's put the onus on individuals to be able to discern what's real and what isn't. And during the past few years, when there's been all this talk of fake news, how do you discern what is fake news and what isn't? And those are serious conversations that people are having in the nation's newsrooms. So if there's one thing that I would impart, having worked in many of the largest newsrooms in the country, in English and Spanish, is that journalists are human. We are human. All of us come with our own personal biases, but we work very hard to, when we enter the newsroom, try to produce news that is as credible as possible, because our jobs are on the line. If our news isn't credible, it isn't accurate, you won't read us, you won't watch us, you won't listen to us, and we're no longer journalists. So know that we're only human, but we work very hard, and we have very serious conversations frequently about what it means to be credible, about what it means to be responsible journalists. And sometimes as viewers and as readers, we have to ask ourselves, is it fake news, or is it just a fact I don't like? There are a lot of facts out there I don't like, but I have to consider them just the same, because it's data and information, and I can't ignore data and information that I don't like. To answer your question, it's put a tremendous onus on individuals to do their own fact checking, become more critical readers and consumers of information. And it's a great responsibility that I'm not sure everyone should have to undertake for themselves. Again, I think that there needs to be a better job of educating people how to be better consumers of news. I think we all could get a refresher on understanding what we're reading, whether it's credible, how to verify its veracity. This is all critical information that I think people need.
Let's talk a little bit about Texas with the time that we have left, because we're both from Texas, right? You're from Houston?
Yes, sir.
When did you move away from Texas?
I left Texas in the early 2000s, but I'm very strongly connected to Texas. So, I still visit all the time, and my mom lives there, and all my childhood friends live there. So I'm still quite connected to it. And I've seen how Texas has transformed itself from like a big southern state to, I think, a bearer of the nation's future in terms of its economy, its diversity, its cultural features, and so much else. I've witnessed that transformation firsthand, and I've been impressed by it. I never would have imagined that that's what was coming, that Texas would sort of become the future of what America likely will be. Here's what I'll say about Texas, is that the brand of conservatism in Texas is kind of laissez-faire. And I think the laissez-faire attitude has in general been a very good thing for Texas, because the laissez-faire attitude has meant that it's been relatively welcoming to immigrants. So Houston, where I'm from, not unlike Dallas and Austin and other big cities in Texas, a very, very diverse place. In fact, the New York Times recently said it was the most diverse city in America, statistically speaking. And so I grew up in a neighborhood that had Venezuelan immigrants and Nigerian immigrants and Vietnamese immigrants, and all very well represented, and most importantly, integrated, right? So when you think about the second most diverse city in America, which is New York City, it's not as well integrated as Houston or many Texan cities, right? So when you think about New York, about here's the Russian neighborhood, here's the Irish neighborhood, here's the Korean neighborhood, but people don't interact as much. In Texas, they do. And I think that's one of the key features of Texas, is that laissez-faire attitude, just let people be, let them do their own thing, has really worked in its favor.
That's really interesting you said that, because I've noticed that myself. I don't know if you were a native Spanish speaker. I'm not. I don't really speak Spanish very well. I've taken many, many years of Spanish, but it hasn't really taken hold in my mind. But that's partly because my parents brought me up to speak English first, and I think it was part of this integration idea, and for better or worse. But when I moved to Chicago, I noticed that segregation of communities, and I tell people I had more of an opportunity to speak Spanish in Chicago because people would actually come up to me and start speaking in Spanish right away. I never really had that here in Texas. And I found that really interesting because people would move to these northern states and create their communities, and you wouldn't have to leave your community, and you'd never have to speak English if you didn't want to.
Yeah, so it was shocking for me. So interestingly, I did the same thing. When I left Houston in 2001, I moved to Chicago. And it was the first time in my life that people would come up to me saying, hola, or they would ask, like, where are you from? What's your ethnicity? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm American, And it's, I guess, something that we had taken for granted growing up in Texas, where there were so many different ethnicities and population groups living together, and nobody really thought anything of it because we were so truly well integrated Whereas in many of the major cities of the North, that degree of integration had not yet at that time been achieved. It's changed. It has changed over time in many American cities. But at the time, it was culture shock for me. I was like, oh boy, now, I see that not every place is like Houston. And I thought Houston was like this rinky-dink, boring southern city, featureless. When I moved away, I grew to appreciate many of its charms, and I appreciate them even more now. That casual, simple, laid-back attitude of the people that's welcoming of others that are different from them is what I miss the most. And I miss the weather. I like the heat. I know. It sounds terrible to say that you like 95-degree weather, but I do. I like heat.
I think as I get older, I do too now. I moved away from Texas to Chicago, like one of the coldest places in the U.S. Because I was tired of the heat and humidity of Austin, actually. But now I'm like, oh, this is kind of nice.
I'm sorry. I have 8 heads or something. I don't mind if it's 90 degrees and humid. I like it.
So what's one long-term trend you see playing out over the next year or several years?
The continued focus on identity is an important one. And it's a very complex political conversation too, which I won't get into because I don't think this is the right sphere for the political conversation. But the conversation around identity is an important business trend too, because how we identify ourselves, who we identify with, what we identify, governs our spending choices, governs how we think about our future, governs where we want to go, what we want to do, what we spend on. So as consumers, that increasing shift on identity, who am I really? Who do I want to associate with? What brands do I want to purchase? What do I want to partake in is important. And so that fragmentation, increasing focus on identity is a very, very important trend that I think will carry through for several years and that has profound business, economic implications, as well as the social and political implications.
All right. You want to try trend or fad, our speed round?
Sure.
All right. Let's see how this goes. Meme stock trading, trend or fad?
Trend because I kind of wish it were a fad because I think it's, again, I'm not sure that it's good for novice investors, but I think it's a trend because of fintech, right? Because of financial innovation. So I think it's just going to be here to stay for a while. Discussion boards, financial innovation, people want a piece of this and they're going to keep going at it.
Getting news through social media, trend or fad?
Fad. My first inclination was to say trend, that it's here to stay. But again, I think there has been, in the last couple political cycles, the last few years, there's been so much of a focus on what's wrong with getting news from social media that I think we'll still get news from social media. But I think people will be turning a more critical eye and will be looking outward to other sources of news too. I think you're going to see fewer people rely solely on social media as their source of news, unless you're talking about, like your newspaper's app or the AP's app or something like that, which I don't really think of as getting news from social media.
How about migration to Sunbelt states, trend or fad?
Fad. I think that's a trend. So I think that's a trend that has been a trend that is slowing down now and has reasons to continue slowing down. I believe in climate change. I think it's a real thing. And I think that as a consequence, people won't want to live necessarily in Phoenix, or I don't know, single out Phoenix. I could also throw in Dallas or Atlanta or any other place in the South that's very warm. Those trends I don't think are sustainable long term. I think decentralization of employment means that people won't necessarily have to run to places where jobs are accumulating anymore because we can work remotely. So if your family is from Buffalo, New York, or your family is from Topeka, Kansas, you can live there if you want because you'll be able to work remotely. And you won't necessarily have to move to the Research Triangle or to Houston or to Austin, wherever jobs are fast growing anymore. And
then finally, thematic investing, trend or fad?
Trend. I think that's been here for a long time, and I think it will be here for a long time. I don't see that going away anytime soon.
Janet, thank you very much for your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
And what's one way that people can reach out to you or find you or follow you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Janet on the Money.
Thanks again, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Trends with Benefits.